$600 million. That is the estimated price Dubai pays for every quiet day in 2026. Not in visible destruction, not in collapsed buildings or broken infrastructure, but in silence. A silence that begins at the very place where this city once felt most alive. Terminal 3 of Dubai International Airport. There was a time when the sound above your head meant something very specific. Engines roaring across the sky did not just signal movement, they signaled wealth, opportunity, the constant circulation of people, capital, and ambition flowing into what was once called the City of Gold. Dubai was not built like a traditional economy, it was built like a system of circulation. People arrive, money follows, services expand, assets grow, and everything depends on that movement never stopping. The airport was not just infrastructure. It was the heart. Every flight landing was a pulse. Every departure was a redistribution of energy. A hub that connected east and west, not just geographically, but economically. A place where global flows converged and were transformed into growth. And then, in March 2026, that rhythm broke. It did not slow down gradually. It did not weaken over time. It snapped. Within 24 hours, more than 150 flights were canceled. Thousands of passengers were left stranded. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of people were suddenly trapped inside a system that no longer functioned the way it was designed to. But the numbers only tell part of the story. What mattered more was what those numbers represented. Because for the first time, Terminal 3 stopped behaving like a gateway. It became a bottleneck. And a funnel where people were no longer entering, but trying to escape. Long lines stretched across check-in counters. Travelers who once arrived with luxury luggage now stood in uncertainty, checking their phones repeatedly, refreshing flight statuses that no longer made sense. The golden visa, once a symbol of exclusivity and power, suddenly felt like something else, not a privilege, but a temporary pass in a system that could no longer guarantee stability. And in that moment, something fundamental changed. Because Dubai's strength was never just in its buildings or its skyline or its luxury. It was in its ability to maintain flow, a continuous, uninterrupted movement of people and money that kept the entire system alive. When that flow is stable, everything works. Hotels fill, restaurants thrive, real estate appreciates. Investments expand, but when that flow is disrupted, everything begins to suffocate, not immediately, but inevitably. Because a system built on constant movement cannot function in stillness. And what we are seeing now is not just a temporary pause. It is the first visible signal that the system itself is under pressure. Not from within, but from the sudden absence of what it depends on most. Movement. $600 million. That is the estimated price Dubai pays for every quiet day in 2026. Not because the city has stopped existing, not because the buildings have disappeared, but because something far more important has slowed down. The flow. To understand what is really happening, you don't start with skyscrapers or luxury hotels. You start at the place where everything begins and ends. Dubai International Airport, Terminal 3. For years, this terminal was not just infrastructure, it was a symbol of global movement. A place where East met West, where capital, people, and opportunity flowed continuously without interruption. The sound of engines overhead was not noise. It was a signal of wealth, of mobility, of a system operating at full capacity. But in March 2026, that sound changed. It no longer carried anticipation, it carried urgency. Inside Terminal 3, what used to be orderly movement turned into congestion, not the kind of congestion caused by growth, but the kind caused by pressure. Lines extended beyond expectation, not because more people were arriving, but because too many were trying to leave at the same time. An estimated 25,000 people moved through the system not as travelers, but as exit seekers. The flights were no longer just scheduled departures. They became escape routes. Within 24 hours, more than 150 flights were canceled. A system built on precision, timing, and reliability began to fracture. The flight map, once dense with connections stretching across continents, started to thin out. Routes disappeared. Frequencies dropped. The network that once defined Dubai's global position began to lose its structure. And this is where the first real signal appears. Because Dubai is not just a city, it is a hub economy. Everything depends on movement. Tourists arriving, investors flying in, workers circulating, goods passing through. The system does not store value the way traditional economies do. It converts flow into revenue, which means when the flow slows down, revenue does not decline gradually. It collapses. And that is why the number $600 million per day is not just a statistic. It is a reflection of how dependent the system is on continuous motion. And once that motion is disrupted, even slightly, the effects multiply quickly. Duty-free zones begin to empty, not because products are unavailable, but because there are fewer people to buy them. Transit lounges grow quieter, not because operations have stopped, but because the volume that sustains them has shifted. What you are seeing is not a failure of infrastructure, it is a failure of flow. And when flow is the foundation of an entire economic model, its disruption is not just a temporary inconvenience. It is the beginning of a systemic response. Because once the heart slows down, the rest of the body does not remain unaffected. It begins to suffocate. And to understand why that disruption spreads so quickly, you have to understand how Dubai was built to function, not as a standalone destination, but as a connector. At the center of its economic model is what's known as the hub-and-spoke system, a structure designed to concentrate global traffic into a single point, then redistribute it efficiently across multiple destinations. Flights from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas all converge into Dubai, creating a dense network of connections that feeds directly into the city's economy. It is one of the most efficient systems ever created. But efficiency comes with a condition: stability. Because when everything depends on timing, coordination, and uninterrupted flow, even a small disruption can create disproportionate effects. And that is exactly what happened. The moment flights began to cancel, the system did not adjust gradually. It unraveled. Routes that depended on connecting passengers began to lose viability. A delayed arrival affects multiple departures. A canceled route reduces transfer volume across several others. What appears to be a localized issue quickly spreads across the entire network. The map that once showed dense lines connecting continents begins to fade, not because the infrastructure is gone, but because the system that sustains those connections has lost its balance. And this is where the real vulnerability of the hub model becomes visible. It is not flexible, it is optimized, which means it performs exceptionally well under ideal conditions. But under stress, it has very little room to adapt. There is no redundancy large enough to absorb sudden shocks. No alternative pathways that can maintain the same level of efficiency. When one part slows down, the rest cannot compensate fast enough, and the effects are immediate. Airlines begin to reduce frequency, not out of strategy, but necessity. Passenger confidence drops, reducing demand for connecting routes. The entire structure, built on precision, begins to lose synchronization. And when synchronization breaks, so does predictability. For travelers, this translates into uncertainty. Flights that once operated like clockwork become unreliable. Connections that used to be seamless become risky. The entire experience shifts from confidence to hesitation. And hesitation is enough. Because in a global travel market, there are always alternatives. Singapore, Istanbul, Doha, other hubs that can absorb redirected traffic, on offering similar connectivity without the same level of disruption. And that is what makes this moment critical. Because the system is not just breaking internally, it is being replaced externally. Traffic does not disappear, it moves. And once that movement begins, it creates a new equilibrium, a new pattern of flow that no longer centers around Dubai. Which means the challenge is no longer just about fixing what was broken. It is about reclaiming what has already shifted. And in systems built on flow, reclaiming movement is far more difficult than maintaining it. Because once people change their routes, once airlines adjust their networks, once confidence is redirected, the system they left behind must compete to bring them back. And that is a very different position from where Dubai once stood. As the system begins to lose flow, the next layer to react is not infrastructure, it is perception. Because Dubai does not operate purely as a physical economy, it operates as a symbolic one. The Burj Khalifa, the Burj Al Arab, Palm Jumeirah, these are not just developments, they are signals. Carefully constructed visual anchors designed to communicate a single message to the world. This is a place of control, stability, and limitless growth. For years, that message worked. Investors saw certainty, tourists saw safety, professionals saw opportunity. And all of that belief was reinforced not through policy, but through imagery. Images of perfect skylines, of uninterrupted luxury, of an environment that appeared detached from the volatility of the surrounding region. But symbols only function as long as they remain consistent with the story they represent. The moment that consistency is disrupted, even slightly, the symbol begins to weaken. And that is what happened. When incidents occurred near key landmarks, when images of disruption began to circulate, the impact was not measured in structural damage. It was measured in contradiction. Because for the first time, the global audience was seeing something that did not align with the established narrative. A skyline associated with perfection now appearing alongside uncertainty. A luxury destination associated with safety now appearing within a context of risk. And that contrast creates tension, not immediate rejection, but doubt, a subtle shift in how the system is perceived. From certainty to possibility. From nothing can go wrong to something could go wrong. And in a system built entirely on eliminating that second idea, even a small reintroduction of uncertainty has consequences, because symbols do not generate value directly, they generate trust, and trust is what allows everything else to function. It allows tourists to book months in advance without hesitation. It allows investors to allocate capital with confidence. It allows professionals to relocate their lives to a place that feels stable. Once that trust is questioned, behavior begins to change. Not dramatically, but enough. A booking is delayed, an investment is reconsidered, a relocation is postponed, and when those small decisions accumulate, they begin to affect the system in measurable ways. Lower occupancy, reduced spending, slower transactions. The symbols still stand, the buildings are still there, but the meaning attached to them has shifted, and that shift is what matters. Because once a symbol no longer fully protects the narrative it was designed to support, the system behind it becomes more exposed, more dependent on performance rather than perception, more vulnerable to comparison rather than assumption. And in a global environment where alternatives exist, that exposure creates pressure, not from collapse, but from competition. Because when trust begins to weaken in one place, it strengthens somewhere else. Once trust begins to weaken, the next layer that becomes visible is the structure of the economy itself. And this is where the illusion of stability starts to fade, because Dubai was never designed as a low-risk, diversified system. It was designed as a high-performance engine, an economy built on scale, speed, and continuous demand. By the end of 2025, Dubai had over 154,000 hotel rooms, under one of the highest concentrations of luxury accommodation in the world. This capacity was not built for moderate occupancy. It was built on the assumption that demand would remain consistently high, often above 80%. That assumption is critical, because when you build at that scale, your costs do not adjust easily. Cooling systems must run regardless of occupancy. Staff must be paid. Maintenance must continue. Energy consumption remains constant. These are fixed costs, costs that do not disappear when guests do. And this creates a structural pressure. When demand is strong, the system generates significant profit. But when demand drops, even slightly, the cost per visitor increases rapidly. And when demand drops sharply, the system begins to strain. This is what makes high fixed cost economies both powerful and fragile. They perform exceptionally well under optimal conditions, but under stress, they deteriorate quickly. In the first weeks of the crisis, revenue across parts of the hospitality sector dropped by around 20%. Hotels began offering aggressive discounts, something rarely seen at this scale in the UAE. But price reductions have limits. They can stimulate demand, but they cannot restore trust. And when the core issue is not price, but perception, lowering prices becomes a signal of weakness rather than an incentive. At the same time, another layer of pressure begins to emerge: real estate. Over the past 3 years, property values in key areas had increased by as much as 60%, driven by strong inflows of capital and high demand. New developments continued to enter the market, with projections suggesting further increases in supply. But real estate, like tourism, depends on cash flow, not just on asset value. Apartments are only valuable if they can be rented, sold, or generate income. When demand slows, those assets become liabilities. Mortgage payments remain, maintenance costs continue, but the income that supports them begins to decline. And this creates a dangerous imbalance, a system rich in assets, but increasingly constrained in liquidity. Because Dubai does not lack infrastructure, it lacks flow. The same pattern appears across the service sector. Restaurants that depended on high-spending tourists begin to see fewer customers. Luxury retail slows down. Supply chains, particularly those importing premium goods from Europe, begin to contract. And all of these changes are connected, because they depend on the same source: external demand. This is the core vulnerability. An economy that relies heavily on spending by people who are not permanently tied to it. Visitors, expats, investors. And when those groups begin to withdraw, even partially, the system must adjust, not just in pricing, but in structure. Because without consistent inflow, the model that once generated rapid growth begins to reveal its limits, and those limits are not temporary. They are structural. When the flow of money slows, the next movement becomes even more important: the flow of people. Because Dubai is not structured like a traditional nation with a deeply rooted population, it functions more like a global corporation. A system where human capital arrives, contributes, and leaves based on opportunity, stability, and return. Nearly 90% of the population consists of expatriates. On paper, this looks like diversity. In practice, it creates a unique kind of vulnerability, because expatriates do not stay out of obligation, they stay out of calculation, and when that calculation changes, movement follows. In the first quarter of 2026, more than 40,000 highly skilled professionals quietly left the city. Over 127,000 visas were canceled as uncertainty began to rise. These are not random departures. These are individuals who form the operational backbone of the system: engineers, financial analysts, healthcare professionals, educators, people who make the system function on a daily basis. And their departure is not loud. It does not create immediate headlines, but it creates gaps. Gaps in knowledge, gaps in service, gaps in continuity. At the same time, another layer of the population faces a different reality: the middle class. For years, rising rental prices had already pushed living costs to high levels. In some areas, rents increased by up to 40% before the crisis even began. For many, the system was already approaching the limit of what was sustainable. When uncertainty entered the equation, that limit was exceeded, and the response was predictable. They left, not out of panic, but out of risk management. Because for those without significant financial buffers, staying becomes a gamble. And when the perceived risk outweighs the expected return, the rational decision is to move. But at the base of the system, the situation becomes even more complex. Millions of migrant workers, many of whom contributed directly to building the city's infrastructure, do not have the same mobility. Bound by employment structures and limited financial resources, they cannot leave as easily. Some remain without stable work as projects slow down. Others face reduced income, but lack the means to exit, and this creates a contrast. At the top, mobility. At the bottom, constraint. And in between, a system that begins to lose its balance, because a functioning economy requires both high-level expertise and foundational labor. When one begins to leave and the other cannot adjust, the system becomes uneven, and that unevenness begins to show in construction delays, in reduced service quality, in operational inefficiencies that were not present before. But perhaps the most visible representation of this shift is not found in statistics. It is found in scenes. Abandoned cars left in parking lots covered in dust, luxury vehicles with keys still inside but no owners returning, new homes left behind with belongings untouched, even pets in some cases left behind as people prioritize departure over everything else. These are not just isolated incidents. They are signals. Signals of how quickly priorities change when stability is questioned. Because in moments of uncertainty, value is redefined. What once represented success becomes secondary. What once felt permanent becomes temporary. And what once seemed essential becomes optional. Because survival, in its simplest form, overrides everything else. And when enough people begin to operate under that logic, the system they leave behind begins to change, not through policy, but through absence. As people leave and capital begins to hesitate, the final shift does not happen inside Dubai. It happens outside. Because the global system does not pause when one node weakens. It reallocates. There is a principle in finance that is often repeated because it is consistently true. Capital is coward. It does not wait for certainty to disappear completely. It moves at the first sign that risk is increasing, even slightly. And once it moves, it rarely returns to the exact same place in the exact same way. That is what we are witnessing. While Dubai is trying to stabilize, other systems are accelerating. Saudi Arabia is expanding aggressively, targeting 150 million visitors by 2030, with over 120 million already recorded by 2025. Mega projects like Neom and the rapid transformation of Riyadh are not just competing for attention, they are absorbing redirected capital. Singapore continues to position itself as a model of stability. A place where predictability is not just promised, but consistently reinforced. Financial flows that once passed through Dubai are now finding alternative routes, and beyond infrastructure and policy, something deeper is shifting. Preference. A new generation of travelers is no longer driven purely by spectacle. They are not searching for the tallest building, the most expensive hotel, or the most extreme display of wealth. They are searching for something else: authenticity, connection, a sense of place that feels grounded rather than constructed. And this is where Dubai faces a different kind of challenge, because much of its success was built on replication, controlled environments, curated experiences, spaces designed to impress quickly, but not necessarily to create long-term emotional attachment. Now, in a world where options are expanding, that model becomes easier to replace, because if one destination offers similar experiences with less perceived risk, the decision shifts, not dramatically, but consistently, and consistency is what reshapes markets. At the same time, regulatory and geopolitical factors begin to influence decisions more directly. Travel advisories, residency requirements, tax considerations, all of these add layers to how individuals and institutions evaluate where to go, where to invest, and where to stay. And when multiple layers align in the same direction, the effect becomes structural. This is where the concept of Dubai as a playground begins to emerge. A place that remains visually impressive, still capable of attracting short-term attention, but increasingly dependent on a smaller and more selective group of visitors. A model that resembles Monaco. High value, but narrow, luxurious, but less dynamic. And that raises the final question. Not whether Dubai will survive. It will. The infrastructure is too significant. The strategic location too valuable. The ability to adapt still present. The real question is, what version of Dubai will emerge from this transition? Will it remain a system built on constant inflow, trying to restore the same model that once worked? Or will it redefine itself into something more stable, more sustainable, less dependent on external flow? Because what has been exposed here is not just a temporary disruption, it is a structural limit. The limit of a model that assumes growth can continue indefinitely as long as movement is maintained. And when that movement is interrupted, even briefly, the system must confront a reality it was not designed to face. That growth has conditions. That stability has boundaries. And that perception, the most powerful asset of all, can change faster than anything else. Dubai may not disappear, but the version of Dubai that existed before March 2026 may no longer exist in the same way. And in that sense, what we are witnessing is not just a crisis, it is a transition from certainty to recalibration.